Hello. Good, at least somebody heard. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank all of you for being here tonight. On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Northern California and the Council on Foreign Relations, I'd like to welcome you to our program, Refocusing U.S. Foreign Policy on the Home Front. We're pleased and honored to have with us tonight Dr. Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Peter Robertson, and I'm Chairman of the Board of the World Affairs Council of Northern California. And this is a special thrill for me because I'm lucky enough to do some work with Dr. Haass, and I think you will get an awful lot out of this, and I know I will too. Before we begin, let me take a moment to thank our members for supporting the World Affairs Council, and also to welcome any new members here tonight. Our members provide a foundation for the work we do, and we cannot thank you enough for continuing to invest in the World Affairs Council. If you're here as a guest, I hope you will consider becoming a member in the future to take advantage of exclusive opportunities such as tonight's program. We would also like to welcome members of the Council on Foreign Relations and our guests from the National Democratic Institute. This evening's program is being recorded for radio and video. We thank our audio engineer, Mr. David Ogilvie, and our video engineer, Mr. Nerv Makaspak. I would now like to introduce this evening's moderator, Michael Nacht, is the Thomas and Allison Schneider Professor of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He's had a diverse career in academia, government, and the private sector, specializing in U.S. national security policy, international affairs, science, and technology. And most importantly, he's wearing an International House tie. In the interest of time, we have included the full bios for our speakers in tonight's program, which I think you all have. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Nacht, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. On behalf of the World Affairs Council and the Council on Foreign Relations, I'm Michael Nacht, your moderator for this evening, and it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Dr. Richard Haass is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, a position he has held since July 2003. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haass was Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Dr. Haass has extensive additional government experience, having served as Senior Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council, and previously served in the Departments of State and Defense, and before that was a legislative aide in the U.S. Senate. Ladies and gentlemen, here to speak about the case of putting America's house in order, please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Haass.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Michael, and thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's great to see so many people interested in foreign affairs, but also domestic affairs, both of which are components of national security. I will be talking about Washington, but unlike Washington, I won't filibuster. I won't go on for great length. What I'd like to do is, more quickly than perhaps is the norm, get to questions and conversation. I'll begin with Michael, and then for the tough questions, I expect we will turn to you. What I wanted to do, though, is just take a few minutes to frame the conversation, if I might, because while I might have predicted that I'd be standing here tonight, what I wouldn't have predicted is that I'd be standing here talking about this theme. And I would not have expected to have ever written a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And I think it's worth taking for a second how I got to this point, not because I'm so interesting, but simply because I think it says something about where we are as a country. Two things really did it. One was the experience of the last 10 or 15 years, and above all, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In a previous book, I described both of them as wars of choice, but I also had real doubts about Iraq from the get-go, and Afghanistan, not initially, but after we got extremely ambitious. And in both cases, the United States chose to essentially try to remake these other societies. And I came to the conclusion that in both cases, whatever progress we made, however desirable it might be, was simply not worth the scale of the investment economically, militarily, diplomatically, or in human terms from the U.S. perspective. And what worried me is that my views of these two conflicts, as well as Vietnam before it, that the lessons that I had learned were not widely shared. And that as I watched some of the debates going on about the so-called Arab Spring, and in particular about Syria, I came to the conclusion that, again, we had tried to do things that I thought were ill-advised, and I feared we were about to try to do them again. And that we hadn't learned the very important lesson that local realities often triumph and trump general concepts that may look good inside the Beltway, but are very hard to turn into reality half a world away. And at the same time, in addition to my concern about where we were going with American foreign policy and what we were doing and how we were doing it, was my concern about things at home. And watching not just what we were doing, but more important, what we weren't doing, how we really weren't tackling the trajectory of our debt, how the deficit was large and until recently growing, how we were not addressing the state of our infrastructure, the state of our schools, how economic growth was roughly half the post-World War II average, and I watched the day-to-day politics of it, and I came to the conclusion that almost all of these things could be dealt with if only, but it was a big if only our politics got out of the way. But our politics refused to do just that. And it was this combination of concern about what we were doing abroad and essentially what we weren't doing at home, or to put it more bluntly, that we were overreaching abroad and underperforming at home, that got me to write this book, that I came away increasingly, and I am increasingly concerned about where this country is. And this is not because I'm a declinist, it's not because I'm a pessimist, but I think it's simply because I'm honest about the situations and the challenges we face. I know we can ultimately deal with them, but it's not inevitable, it's not automatic. We've got to change. And what I wanted to do was write a book that suggested how it is I believe the United States needs to change, what it does abroad and what it does at home, in order to be able to shape the 21st century in ways that I believe it could be shaped and actually needs to be shaped if we are going to prosper in every sense of the word here at home. And it's an awfully complicated world. This is a world in many ways that's far more complicated than the world many of us grew up in, given the diffusion of power, the fact that we no longer live in this relatively straightforward bipolar world, but in a world where all sorts of individuals and groups and countries can wield all sorts of power. We're here at home. The complexity of what is going on in our society is far greater than it ever was before. The environment in which policy is made is far more complex than it ever was before. And I thought that people needed something of a roadmap for how to decide what it is to do and what not to do, to choose priorities. We can't do everything everywhere every time. We have to have some basis, some mechanism for choosing. And if we simply react to what comes at us, we're going to be really disadvantaged because a lot of stuff is coming at us fast and furious. So what I thought I could do was think through what would be something of a strategic plan or framework for the United States. And I thought long and hard about it and came up with this idea of restoration, that we need to restore the foundations of American power here at home, and that we need to restore some of the balances, the balance between foreign policy and domestic policy, and within foreign policy, some of the balances on where we pay the most attention to. And one way to help think about it, and it's actually as I continue to talk about it, is to think of foreign policy as a subset of national security. They're not the same. And national security depends on many things, including the strength of our economy and the cohesion of our society. And if our economy is strong and our society is cohesive, then we will have a capacity to deal with many of the things that are likely to go on overseas. And by contrast, if our economy isn't strong and our society is not together, we're going to have extraordinary difficulty dealing with the world. And if we can't deal with the world, we have to also face the reality that what happens out there doesn't stay there. The world is not Las Vegas. But if bad things are or were to happen outside the borders of the United States, they will find their ways across our borders. We can't be a giant gated community. Borders are not barriers in the 21st century. So foreign policy at the end of the day isn't so foreign. It's very much related to what goes here at home, but again, what goes on here at home very much affects our capacity to act and lead abroad. And as I say, under this idea of restoration, I try to do some rebalancing. In foreign policy, to boil it down, what I'm essentially arguing for is the United States should stop being fixated on the greater Middle East. If we had gotten together 15 years ago, and if your speaker had stood up and say, the United States, in the aftermath of the Cold War, when it no longer faced a great power rival, was going to spend most of its calories, if you will, most of its resources in the national security realm, trying to remake Afghanistan and Iraq, you would have wondered why you had invited that speaker. That does not sound, if you will, strategic, but that's exactly what we've done. And what I'm trying to argue for then is a rebalancing, not where we walk away from the Middle East, but the Middle East is simply one part of the world rather than the part of the world where the United States gets involved. In the Middle East, yes, we have interest there, but it's important to recall a couple of things. One is there's no great powers in the Middle East. And second of all, while we have interests, our ability to influence those interests is limited. Many of the things that we're worried about most in the Middle East, in particular the trajectory of these societies, what we learned is that even though we've sent 2.5 million Americans, if you add up all the Americans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, even though we've sent 2.5 million Americans there for more than a decade, we have not been able to remake this part of the world in our image. And that should teach us something about the limits of our influence. And again, my argument is not to ignore it. The Middle East is important still. We have obviously important ties to Israel. Energy is important. The concern about the spread of nuclear weapons, about terrorism. We have real interest there. But what we've got to do is remember two things. We've got to limit our involvement to a level where where we think we can actually accomplish things. It doesn't always make sense to do more if you don't get more for it. And second of all, we've got to take a step back. The Middle East is not the entire chessboard. It is a square on the chessboard. And we've got to think not simply then about the direct costs, but if you will, the indirect costs. If we do more things there, what can't we do as much of in other parts of the world or here at home? So I am arguing for a slight dialing down, if you will, of our ambitions in the Middle East, at the same time a dialing up of what we do in Asia. And the reason is in Asia and the Pacific, that's the part of the world where the great powers are increasingly interacting, where after 3 decades of essentially an economic dominated region where growth was phenomenal, we're beginning to see the stuff of history happening in Asia. Nationalism, great power competition and friction, the relationship among major powers such as China, Japan, divided Korean peninsula still, the reality of nuclear proliferation, and so forth. And what we have then in Asia, unlike the Middle East, is 2 things. One is we actually do have the major powers of this era. And second of all, I would argue the United States is in a position, given its instruments of power, its Navy, its Air Force, its economy, its diplomacy, to influence developments there. So in Asia, there's actually a greater potential for the United States to carry out a foreign policy where we can protect our very real interests. I'd also argue we should be doing more closer to home in North America. This is a part of the world where we have 450 million people, the United States, Canada, Mexico. We're energy self-sufficient, and we actually have the potential to be the engine of global economic growth. And I would think that we need to be very creative about things like a next generation of NAFTA, greater integration in North America, and to think about how we can build not just a greater community in the energy, but in economics and other parts of life. So again, this is a rebalancing within foreign policy, and then secondly, a rebalancing between foreign policy and what goes on here at home. And what I would simply say here at home, and we can talk about it in greater detail, is that we've got to rebuild and restore the foundations of American economic growth. Again, we are growing now, and have been for the last 5 years or so, at roughly half the average rate that we've grown at since World War II. For most of the world post-World War II era, the United States grew at around 3.3, 3.4%, and now we're much closer to 2%. And all sorts of consequences, but we're not going to be generating the resources we need in order to act and lead in the world unless we get it right. But you just can't wave a magic wand. We've got to do some other things. And I talk a lot about where we need to invest in capital. Some of it's physical capital, our infrastructure, the lack of high-speed rail, the lack of modern airports. The United States now ranks somewhere around 25 or 30 in the world in terms of the quality of our infrastructure. It means we're much less competitive than we ought to be. We're wasting an awful lot of time and money as a result. We're less resilient as a society than we need to be. We're also not developing the human capital that we should. A lot of people around the world queue up to go to Stanford, Harvard, Princeton. I've yet to meet the young man or the woman around the world who queues up to go to public schools in say, New York or Washington, D.C. Yet, that's the common educational experience most of our young people go through. We're not investing in our own future. We're not investing there. I'm hoping that comprehensive immigration reform passes. Getting more people of talent and education to come and stay in this country would be an extraordinary boon. If you read the recent issue of Fortune, the Fortune 500 issue, it's interesting how many corporations that have succeeded in this country can be traced back to immigrants. It's a powerful driver of American economic growth. So the question is what we will do there. And what I'm basically trying to suggest is that what we do and don't do in terms of investing in human and physical infrastructure, human and physical capital, what we do or don't do, in particular in dealing with long-term entitlement challenges, will have a tremendous impact on our future. And what I'm saying is that we actually now have the necessity of doing this. We've got to get this right if we're going to have the capacity to lead and act. But we've also got the opportunity. And by that I mean, this is a really rare moment in history, where for now 25 years, the United States has not woken up every day facing a great power rival. Most of history of the last few hundred years in the modern era of international history, say since the mid-17th century, most of it has been one or more great powers interacting. And if you think about the 20th century, you had 2 world wars and you had a Cold War. Well, here we are now. Next year, by the way, marks the 25th anniversary of the end of the Cold War. On 11/9, it will be 2014. And the United States doesn't have a great power rival. This gives us tremendous time and space to focus here at home. Again, it doesn't mean ignoring the world. This is not isolationism, but it does mean a rebalancing. So we ought to take advantage of this opportunity and rebuild our capacities so we can discourage the emergence of a great power challenger. If one emerges, we can cope with it. But what we've got to do is have the discipline both to limit or to redirect what it is we do abroad and to do what needs doing here at home. Will we do it? I don't know. I used to say in my last job, I was the head of policy planning, not policy predicting. My crystal ball is no better than yours. You know, when I watch our politics sometimes, I get worried. I get close to despair. You know, Churchill had that famous quote when he was once asked about Americans. He said, Americans can be counted on to do the right thing, but only after they do everything else. Well, we're still in that phase of doing everything else. I don't know how far along we are. And I hope we get it right. And the reason is this, that the stakes are enormous. Let me put it this way. The alternative to an American-led world is not a world that's led by China or led by Japan or led by Europe or led by India or led by Russia or led by Brazil or anybody else. There's no other country out there that has both the capacity, the inclination, the habits of global leadership. It's basically the United States or no one. This is not bragging. This is not to be confused with unilateralism. I'm not suggesting we can do it alone. By definition, leadership implies followership. And the kinds of challenges that are out there must be met collectively. We can't do it all by ourselves. But if we don't get it right, the alternative, again, is not that anyone else will do it and step in for us. It will be a world that is unled. And a world that is unled is a world that will be increasingly characterized by disorder, by messiness, by violence, by conflict. It'll be a world where it'll be much harder to interact economically. It'll be a world that will be less safe, less open, less prosperous. And again, what I said before, if that were to happen, that wouldn't stay there, but it would come here. And what we would find is that the quality of life in the United States had diminished significantly. So we end up in a place, as a result, where there's a domestic reason, if you will. If we want to have the kind of lives we want to have here at home, we have to be willing to help lead and shape the world But if we want to be in a position to help shape and lead the world, we have to put our house in order here at home. So again, one way to think about national security is that it's increasingly two sides of a coin, and one side is domestic policy, and one side is our foreign policy. And what I'm trying to basically do here is suggest we've got to adjust both. And again, we've got the opportunity and the necessity of doing it, and what I simply am trying to do is put out the arguments in the very sincere hope that we make the most of this opportunity, because the alternatives, quite honestly, are not attractive at all. So that's the argument. I look forward to your questions about the things haven't answered or the things you disagree with. And if there's one or two things you agree with, don't hold back from saying that as well. Thank you very much. Sir.
Thank you, Richard, for those opening remarks. You put a lot on the table. We already have some great questions. Let me start with this. If President Obama were here listening to you, he might say something like the following. What do you mean dial down in the greater Middle East? I've been accused of dialing down too much. I've withdrawn forces from Iraq. I'm withdrawing forces from Afghanistan. The Libyan operation was part of a NATO UN-sanctioned exercise. I've resisted getting involved in Syria, despite possibly the Syrians going past the red line on chemical weapons use. I haven't pushed too far on trying to intervene in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. I haven't been involved in the Egyptian civil war. I have yet to make firm commitments as to what I'm going to do in Iran. Mm-hmm. I have dialed down. In fact, I'm being accused of leading from behind, of not dialing up, of not being more interventionist and using American power more successfully. How would you respond to those sets of observations?
A couple of ways. One is a lot of what you say is true. The United States has dialed down in the greater Middle East, and I welcome that. I think one of the areas I disagreed with him in his first term was where he first dialed up. And the president tripled U.S. force levels in Afghanistan. He expanded U.S. war aims in Afghanistan, and I simply disagreed with that. But I welcome the fact that he's dialing down. And indeed, there is a lot of similarity between what I'm arguing for this book in terms of foreign policy and what the Obama administration is doing. And I'm actually one of those who, and we can talk about it more as I expect we will, that argues that he is right for the most part in resisting more direct involvement in a place like Syria. And I also support the so-called pivot or rebalancing towards Asia. I think that's, again, it's a strategic adjustment that is welcome. Where my bigger differences are with the Obama administration is less in foreign policy, but it's more on the other half of the national security coin on domestic policy. For example, the president brought about, after Congress wouldn't, if you recall, he unilaterally, as administrative action, brought about the Simpsons-Bowl Commission to deal with the budget challenge, and then the administration walked away from it. The administration, for the first term, did not have much in the way of a global trade policy. Now it's introduced one. The administration has not done certain things, and hopefully, again, we'll get comprehensive immigration reform, we'll see. But my concerns have been more with what we haven't done at home than with what actually, for the most part, we have done abroad.
Okay, thank you. We'll shift back and forth between domestic and international issues, but one sort of follow-up on the Middle East. There are several questions here about Syria, what U.S. policy in Syria ought to be,
sure.
And also, if your approach is implemented, how would we expect Israel to react, and will we be serving our own interests and Israeli interests if we implement the Haass approach?
Syria is a really tough issue, and it's tough because you've got to begin with some honest assessment. The United States does have interest in Syria. We have strategic interest there, given the Middle East matters, given that Iran and others are involved, that Syria has become something of a proxy battleground. It also has the capacity to spread and destabilize a part of the world that doesn't need more destabilization. So we have strategic interest there. And the United States also has humanitarian interest. Anytime 80,000, 90,000 people die, the United States, one of the things that makes America America is that we do care about such things. So I'm not arguing we have no interest. On the other hand, something I said before, I come back to 2 points. even if the United States were to do a lot more in Syria, it's not at all obvious to me that we could get a lot more for it. I mean, imagine you ended up getting heavily involved militarily to get rid of the Assad regime. I hope that no one thinks that would be the end of the problem. That would be the end of one phase of the problem. But all the people who now are there with arms, who want to get rid of the Assad regime, that's the one thing they can agree on. They have no agreement whatsoever on the future trajectory of Syria. And then we would be off to the races, I think, in a prolonged civil war. So we should have no illusion about how difficult it will be. Indeed, we had 140,000 Americans at the peak in Iraq. We had 100,000 Americans plus at the peak in Afghanistan, and we saw how difficult it is, even with a full occupying army, to shape the physical and political trajectory of a country. So we should have no illusions about how difficult it would be to transform Syria. This is a minority-majority country where a minority has been ruling a majority for a long time. There's an almost unlimited amount of score settling that the people in that country are prepared to undertake. And then secondly, Syria is not our only concern in the Middle East. It's not our only concern in the world. What you've got to do is take a step back and say, okay, if we do get involved in Syria, not just what will we accomplish there at what cost, what will be the direct cost, but then what will be the indirect consequences? What can't we do, or what won't we be able to do if we get heavily involved in Syria? What might it mean, say, for our ability to contend with the situation in Iran, with their nuclear program? Or what might it mean for our desire to stabilize the situation in the Asia-Pacific? What might it mean for our desire to do more at home in terms of rebuilding the foundations of our society? So my argument is we need to put a ceiling on what it is we are prepared to do in Syria, consistent with, again, what I think is the limits to what we can reasonably expect to accomplish, with the reality of all the things we have to concern ourselves outside. I think we ought to focus on trying to stop the spread of the Syrian contagion to the rest of the region. I mean, shoring up Jordan, protecting Turkey, trying to limit the spillover into places like Lebanon and Iraq. I am prepared to help Syria, the opposition. I would be willing to take a step the administration hasn't been willing to as yet, which is provide lethal aid to those aspects of the Syrian opposition who we believe their goals are compatible with our own. But again, I would put limits on what we're prepared to do, particularly in the area of direct military involvement. For the most part, I would argue against that.
Okay. Some claim that not all, but a chunk of U.S. involvement in the Middle East for many decades has been oil dependent. And if the projections about the impact of fracking of natural gas and maybe of oil as well come true, the U.S. will sooner rather than later be energy independent for the first time. How might that enable us then to implement some of your ideas about being less involved in the Middle East?
The way I look at that, and I think the basic thrust of the question is right, is the United States is on the cusp of what you might call energy self-sufficiency, or North America is. If you add up Canada, Mexico, and the United States, there's an extraordinary production going on thanks to these technological breakthroughs with natural gas and oil. The United States is reaching a 25-year high now of oil production, a 25-year low in imports. By most estimates, we have the largest natural gas reserves in the world. It really is it's a reminder of what American innovation and technology can accomplish. This was not a government program, if you will. This was not on the ground. This was in the ground.
Under the ground.
Technological innovation, quite extraordinary. And it has obvious strategic consequences. But we can't become energy independent. By independence, that to me is an unhelpful notion, because most of the world is still dependent one way or another on Middle Eastern energy. And if there were major interruptions in Middle Eastern energy production or transit, all of our economic partners and so forth would suffer, so we would suffer. If their economies stop growing and start shrinking, how are we going to export to them? The answer is we can't. So energy independence I don't find to be a terribly useful concept. That said, we have a little bit more cushion than we used to. The United States is certainly less dependent in the short run on oil fluctuations. And that gives us, again, a little bit of a cushion. It's not an argument for walking away from the Middle East. but it is an argument for, I think, placing it in a slightly different perspective than we have over the last few decades.
There are a couple of questions about trends in U.S. demography, that our population is growing older, it's becoming less Caucasian, larger numbers of Hispanics, larger numbers of Asian Americans. Would that also facilitate a reduction in America's interest in the Middle East?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think so. Again, most Americans are not of Middle Eastern descent. And the United States has had all sorts of reasons to be involved in the Middle East, some strategic, some economic, some political. I think that continues. The Middle East, will still be considered extraordinarily special given the holy places and the history of Jerusalem and Israel. I still believe that many Americans will continue to believe there's a special obligation given the history towards Israel. I can't read that. What does that say?
It says, Dr. Haass, please move your mic to your tie for better sound.
See, not just anyone could get the job as moderator.
That's actually not what it said. I just thought I'd say that.
Are we okay now? I hope I don't have to go back and repeat everything I said up tonight.
Go back up there.
But I think the United States, will continue to have, in many ways, fairly consistent interests in the Middle East. We're still going to have concern about proliferation, concern about terrorism. Energy, as we've just talked about, is still going to be a reality. We're still going to have ties to Israel. So none of that goes away. Demography, though, raises another point, which is, yes, the United States is getting older. People are living longer and all that. But we also have a much more balanced demography than many other countries. And by that I mean because of immigration and the rest, we've also got most other countries either have basically the idea of sort of triangles or pyramids. And either they've got a lot of old people. If you look at Europe and Japan, there's an overweighting, if you will, of the elderly, which as I get older I think is an increasingly good idea. But I understand some of the consequences of it. And a lot of countries in the developing world are just the opposite. You have youth bulges and tremendously high percentages of their population under the ages of 20 or 25. And that also puts burdens, because most societies depend very heavily on the working and the productivity of people roughly between 16 or 18 on one hand and, say, 60, 65 on the other. So countries that are heavily weighted with populations outside, younger than 18 or higher than 60 or so, the ratio of those working to those who are dependent moves in unhelpful areas. The United States actually finds itself somewhat better situated than most other countries, and to me, it's one of the other structural advantages that this country has. It's also yet another argument, I think, for continued openness on immigration. There's many other arguments, I believe, for comprehensive immigration reform, but that's one of them.
Okay. Turning now to a domestic question. There are several questions here that are related to U.S. healthcare costs,
right,
and to other social entitlement programs.
Okay.
And given the political gridlock in Washington, how can one reasonably hope that we'll make some real headway here to achieve the kinds of economic strengthening you're calling for?
It's an important question. Just a couple of things to say, and I'll get to the direct answer. One is we're spending roughly 18%, 18%, almost a fifth of our wealth on healthcare. Extraordinarily high. It's approximately twice the average of what the other wealthy countries in the world do. And if we live twice as long, or we were twice as healthy, one could say it's probably worth it, but we're not. Our healthcare outcomes are no better. And it's a reminder, I think, of a really important point, that how much you spend on something is not nearly as important as how you spend it. So just because we spend, for example, as much per pupil in K through 12 as other places, but the educational outcomes aren't as good. It's just a reminder. So the next time someone focuses just on how much you spend on defense or health or anything else, very quickly go through that and really ask, well, hold it. How are we spending it? Because you can get more for less if you make the right decisions. So more doesn't necessarily get you more. And it's true in health and everything else. I think we've also got to deal with this. It's not simply a burden on our economy and on our competitiveness, but obviously the obligations we're building up through Medicaid and Medicare are unsustainable. The problem is not over the next year, over the next 3 years, over the next 5 years, but roughly starting 8 to 10 years out, we are on an unsustainable trajectory. And we're basically going to have very little left in our economy other than our ability to fund entitlements, particularly if and when interest rates go up. By the time we then pay off the debt and deal with the entitlement obligations of Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, we're going to have precious little left for investment in physical capital and human capital. So we've got it. We're on, again, an unwise trajectory. What you've got to do on the entitlement side is obviously, I think, things like means testing. We've got to change the legal approach to certain things in medical care to deal with torts and so forth. There's lots of rationalization we've got to build into the healthcare system. We can talk about that in whatever detail you want, but there are things that can be done to basically reduce the emphasis on paying for testing and procedures and put a much greater emphasis on outcome. The disparities, if you go from hospital to hospital, region to region, and what we do and the outcomes we get shows you that something is drastically wrong. So, and it's going to be difficult because there's powerful interests arrayed. Let me just make one last political point. Most of the areas that I'm talking about when it comes to domestic policy, we do what we do, not because it's necessarily the best way to do it, but because there are powerful interests that have a stake in continuing to do it that way. And if you disagree, for example, with our Medicare system, then you've got to then think about why it is. One of the reasons it is because you have powerful lobbies and special interests who want to keep it that way, in particular groups like the AARP. And then you've got to then think about how do you create countervailing forces in American politics that will put forward a competing agenda. And American politics, if you will, is a competitive marketplace. And right now, certain special interests dominate. And I think the big question is how do you get it so special interests don't dominate to the extent that the national or collective interest loses out? And healthcare is one of the principal areas where I believe it's important to ask that question.
Do you think that the current sequester, which evidently no one expected to really be implemented, is actually helping or hurting our foreign policy and status in the world, or it's not actually directly relevant to any major shifts?
The sequester is only doing one good thing. And the one good thing that the sequester is doing, it's reducing the debt to GDP ratio. And you may have seen in the last week all sorts of articles in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and other places. The Congressional Budget Office came out with a new report. And what it basically says is the deficit problem is less than we thought it would be. And there's a number of reasons why. One of the reasons, some taxes have gone up and so forth, but one of the reasons why is because of the sequester. So by reducing government spending, it has helped. That's the only good thing the sequester has done. The sequester is really dumb public policy. It is lowest common denominator public policy because it treats all spending equally. But all spending is not equal. Some spending is investment. Some spending is not. So what you want to have in a budget is to favor investment. But the sequester doesn't do that. On top of that, what the sequester is dampening down economic activity in the short run at a time where we're growing only half or two-thirds our historical average. So the sequester has it exactly wrong. What you want to do is actually increase economic stimulus now, I would argue, help get things up to higher levels, but you want to deal with the long-term challenge of entitlements. So rather than think about limiting short-term spending, you want to actually have more short-term spending of the right sort, i.e. investment in physical capital and human capital, and you want to lock in reductions in the long-term growth of entitlements. We do none of that. So we've actually got it exactly wrong in how we're going about this. And let me say one other thing about entitlements and the rest. If you look at all the graphs, the real increases start kicking in roughly between 2020 and 2025. The one thing we know is you can't change entitlement policy in 2022 for those about to retire then. That's Lucy in the football. You can't do that. The only way you can build political support in this country for changing entitlements is to give 5, 10, 15-year phasing in period so people can adjust their lives accordingly. If you tell someone that when they're 45 years old, that instead of a retirement age at 66 or 67, it's going to be 69, or you tell people that these types of medical benefits are only going to kick in a little bit later, if you haven't been counting on it as in something immediate. But if you're 64 or 66 and you suddenly move the goalposts, that to me is not right, it's not fair. So if we want to change the entitlement trajectory in 10 or 15 years, we've got to do it now. The problem is, in a funny sort of way, the sequester has taken some of the pressure off because we seem to have we're doing better than we thought on near-term budget goals. But if it takes the pressure off now, it's only going to increase the pressure down the road. So again, we've got a little bit of an opportunity here, a little bit of a respite. We've got to use it.
There were several questions and comments in the cards here from the audience about defense spending, that if you really want to dial back, if we didn't have the military capability to intervene, then we'd have to dial back. So should the defense budget be cut more than is currently being planned? And if so, any thoughts about reductions in the defense budget? And if so, in what areas?
Not a lot more than it already is. Defense got cut roughly 8% before the sequester hit. Now it's getting cut another 8%. It's below $500 billion now, core defense spending. That sounds high, but it's quite low in percentage terms by historic averages of the United States. We spent far higher percentages of our budget and our wealth as a country during various periods during the Cold War. Plus, we're no longer spending significantly in Iraq, and we will soon not be spending significantly in Afghanistan. So it turns out that while defense spending contributed to some of our fiscal problems, they were not contributing the lion's share. It was probably about 10 to 15% were related to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so dialing down defense is not going to, it didn't cause the problem while it contributed to it. So cutting defense a little bit helps, but it doesn't solve the problem. No, if you know, Willie Sutton used to rob banks because that's where the money is. If you want to deal with the real problems, you've got to get to entitlements because that's where the obligations are. And again, now that said, we don't, what I said before, simply spending more on defense doesn't get you more security. You've got to spend it smart. In some areas, we may actually need slightly more defense spending. I would think, for example, to have more of an air and naval presence in Asia, whereas I argued I think we ought to be doing a lot more. That we built up the Marines and the Army because of Iraq and Afghanistan. I think we can go back to probably pre-Iraq, pre-Afghanistan levels of Army and Marines there. We need to think about some of the really expensive hardware we're buying, an area that Michael Nacht knows a lot about. We might want to think about the size and some of the details of our nuclear inventory. So I get, again, a lot less excited about the level of defense spending, whether it's $510 billion, $480 billion, whatever, than the details of what we're spending on. But I would just make the point that there's a strong case for a strong defense. The United States faces some real challenges out there, and we don't want to invite challenges. Defense is not simply something used. It's a bit of an insurance premium. You invest in defense in order to discourage certain kinds of challenges. So that can be a pretty good investment. So I don't think we should look at defense as somehow the solution to what ails us. We need a strong defense, but there are things we can and should do to make some detailed adjustments there.
Okay. A couple of questions on the possible reactions of other states to a policy of dialing down, including our allies. When we dialed down after Vietnam to some degree, it led to a lot of nervousness in East Asia and in Europe. In the most recent troubles with North Korea, for the first time in many years, Japanese and South Korean parliamentarians spoke openly about the need for their own nuclear weapons because they didn't believe that the U.S. security guarantees were credible to protect them. So what is the likely impact, even if we pivot toward Asia, of Japanese or South Korean or in Europe to this dialing down process?
Well, one of the reasons I want to dial up a bit in Asia is just for the reason you suggest. Asia's worked extraordinarily well for decades. I mean, it's quite remarkable that you've had this economic dynamism and it hasn't spilled over into conflict or major political military friction. But it could happen. We're beginning to see the emergence of nationalism. You see all these territorial disputes that haven't been dealt with. You've had nothing in Asia, say between Japan and China, nothing of the reconciliation that you had, say, between France and Germany. You don't have anything like the political, military, diplomatic circuitry and institutions in Asia that you have in Europe. It's the reason the United States still plays a critical role. And I don't want to leave Asia, if you will, to Asians. And I don't mean that in any derogatory way. I mean in the sense we have enormous stakes there. And if the United States is not active in every way, diplomatically, economically, militarily, increasingly then that part of the world will get on the train of history. And that means countries will arm more. Some of them will rethink their nuclear positions. Nationalism will become much more salient. And you have the potential, if you will, for a return of history scenario where 21st century Asia could begin to look like early 20th century Europe. We've seen how that movie goes. We do not want to have a replay of that movie now. So there's, I think, a powerful reason to stay heavily involved and to become more heavily involved there. In the Middle East, I've made the case, I think, for dialing down. Some of our friends and allies won't like it. There's right now, for example, lots of frustration in parts of the Arab world with what the United States is not doing in Syria. So be it. So be it. I'm prepared to accept that for the reasons I articulated before. I want to do more in North America. In Europe, I think we can do less because Europe is not going to play the same role in the 21st century that it played in the 20th century. And that's good news. Europe was way too prominent in the 20th century. And the last I checked, there were 2 world wars and a Cold War that were centered there. Europe right now, though, has had widespread reconciliation. It has an awful lot of integration. The principal challenges are economic. We can help there to some extent. I like the idea of a U.S.-European free trade agreement. The real challenges, though, to Europe now are what the Europeans themselves are going to be doing. And the good news is Europe doesn't look like a battlefield. So actually, the fact that the United States already has dialed down in Europe, we probably have, what, 1/4 the military presence in Europe now than we had at the height of the Cold War. And even that 1/4 is not oriented towards Europe. It's more of a place where it sits, so then we can work with NATO to potentially get involved outside of Europe. Again, your strategy has to adapt. It would be foolhardy if we didn't make adjustments as our interests change, as the threats changed, as the technology changed. Why wouldn't we dial up in some places and dial down in some places?
Would such an approach give mischievous ideas to the Kremlin or to the Al-Qaeda leadership or even to the Chinese to act in ways that would not be in U.S. interests if they found that our presence was reduced?
First of all, groups like Al-Qaeda, they beat to their own drummer to begin with. They're not just reacting, they're acting. And to some extent, in different ways, that's true of other countries. Second of all, I'm not sitting here tonight making a case for isolationism. I didn't write a book about isolation. I write a book, it's just the opposite. It's a book about strategy. And it's a book about staying involved, but staying involved in smart ways. So we're not leaving the field to any other country or forces. As I said, they are not, if you look at the Chinas and Russias, able and willing to take a leadership role in the world. In the case of Al-Qaeda, they don't have a positive agenda. They simply have a destructive agenda. What we really want to do is see them as best we can eliminated from the face of the earth. So we've got to stay heavily involved in the world. The more serious question is about the Chinas and Russias, I would say, is also look at the biggest challenges are not the challenges necessarily they pose, but it's the challenges to them. You know, Mr. Putin has been very good at channeling, if you will, Russian resentment. The Russians have had a pretty bad 2.5 decades in many ways. They've lost an awful lot of status with the end of the Cold War. Other than gas and oil, they don't have all that much of an economy. Their population has shrunk down to about 143 million. They've lost a big chunk of the Soviet Union, obviously, also. Mr. Putin has been very good at tapping into that resentment, and Russia now plays a certain angry spoiler role in many places around the world. They've also been helpful on occasion, say in Afghanistan, but in many cases they played something of a spoiler role. The real question is, though, how will he make Russia a vibrant country going forward? What are his answers to make Russia a modern, successful economy to come up with a political system that has legitimacy at home. I'm not so sure they're up to that challenge. Or China. Everyone talks, not everyone, many people talk about a Chinese threat. Look at the challenges China faces. We talked about demographics before. You've got far more young men than young women because of the one-child policy. You've got far more old people than working-age people increasingly. The ratio is shifting in bad ways. You've got more than 100,000 sizable political protests a year going on in China. You've seen the pictures of the air and the water. You've got an environmental catastrophe. You still have hundreds of people living in rural poverty. Economic growth has gone from the double figures down to 6 or 7%. China faces extraordinary internal challenges. So I think China is going to be faced for the foreseeable future with dealing with those. Now, there's a danger there that if the regime gets frustrated, nationalism may be one of the recourses. So, but I would simply say that, again, we want to be active. We want people in China to understand that they cannot find satisfaction towards more adventurous foreign policy, but that they really do need to fix or deal with all their challenges domestically, which are, I think, considerable, to say the least. So again, I think it's important that when we look at these other countries, we look at them realistically in terms of the challenges that their national security, so to speak, faces.
There are a couple of questions here on Iran, saying in the short term, a real test case of the Haass thesis might be Iran. Yeah. Can you offer any specifics about how your approach to Iran might differ from what the Obama administration might do with respect to Iran?
I don't know who asked that question, but I think it's the toughest single question to pose. And by that I mean, if my argument is for dialing down in the Middle East, what's going on in Iran is a challenge to it. It's one of the many reasons I'm hoping that the current approach of diplomacy, sanctions, the threat of military force is enough to persuade Iran to put a certain limit on its nuclear program that, to put it bluntly, is enough for them but not too much for the outside world. And if we can do that, I think everybody would be better off. If, however, that doesn't work and Iran continues to press ahead, then the United States and the world would be faced with a fairly fateful decision about whether to use military force in a preventive mode to interrupt the advance of the Iranian nuclear program, or to live with it. And I would simply say that either course, either interrupting it with military force or living with a nuclear Iran, has real consequences, significant economic and strategic consequences. I don't much like either choice. At some point, we may be forced to choose. And I would say if we did choose the path of using military force, it would obviously be inconsistent, in the near term at a minimum, with the thrust of this book. And it's one of the reasons, again, that I'm not anxious to use military force. I haven't ruled it out if it comes to that. We'll have to make that assessment at the time. But to me, it argues very strongly then that we ought to do everything we can with sanctions, with the diplomatic offer, with the threat of military force against Iran to try to get them to accept limits. The one area where I'd probably be a little bit different than the administration is with diplomacy. And not so much now. Nothing's going to happen in the next few months while Iran focuses on its internal politics, on its presidential election. But you will have a new Iranian leadership, at least below the supreme leader, in the next couple of months. And what you want to do there, I think, is make an offer that is quite generous to Iran, that if they said yes, though, that we could live with, that put sufficient limits and transparency on what they do. But we also want the regime there to have to explain to its own people why it would reject an offer that was reasonable, did not humiliate Iran, and would get them out from under significant economic constraints. I want to put the regime under pressure there in ways that we haven't done.
In David Sanger's book, Confront and Conceal, he talks about the use of drones and cyber, among other techniques, as ways for the U.S. to stay engaged, but not to have the high visibility, high profile of boots on the ground. But we see already the cost of this, for example, a deteriorating relationship with Pakistan. Where do such techniques fit into your approach?
Let me say two things. Look, drones are an instrument. I think they're a useful instrument. We just have to understand that they're simply one of the tools we have in the kit bag of dealing with terrorism. And I would simply say they ought to be an exceptional instrument, that we ought not to ever use them casually or in any situation where we don't have to. And I would say we should only use drones when we're certain of high-value targets, when there's no other good way to get them because the host government is unable or unwilling to go after them, when the special forces type option doesn't look viable, and when we're pretty confident that there won't be collateral damage. Don Rumsfeld raised the question when he was Secretary of Defense that what's the metric for judging how you're doing in the war on terrorism, and are we generating more terrorists? Are we radicalizing terrorists by what we're doing to go after the terrorists who exist? And we don't want to be, if you will, creating more terrorists than we're arresting or killing, to put it bluntly. We want to make sure the numbers are working in our favor. And with drones, we've got to ask ourselves every time before we use them, is it worth it? Are we basically going to get more in this struggle against terrorism than we're going to stimulate or cause? And my hunch is if we're really rigorous about that, we'll use drones sometimes, but probably not quite as often as we have. It's a special case when there's American citizens involved. There ought to be special legal and political hurdles to cross in that instance. Let me say one other thing, because Michael raised it, which is the question of Pakistan. I would say whether we use drones or not, we're going to have enormous problems with Pakistan. This has been a country with whom we've had enormous problems for my entire professional career and before it, and we'll have it afterwards. This is I believe, deeply flawed country, and it's a country that worries me. This is a country with 185 million people, second largest non-Muslim country in the world. For most of its 60-plus years of existence, it's been a democracy in name only. You've had military governments, and even when you've had civilians, they haven't really been in control of the country. It's a country with the world's most powerful terrorists who are running around in many cases with the support of the so-called authorities. It has the world's fastest-growing nuclear program. We spend a lot of time talking about an Iran that wants to develop a nuclear weapon, a lot of time about a North Korea that has a half dozen. This is a country with hundreds of nuclear weapons that's turning them out faster than anybody else. This is a scary situation out there. And just take for a second the Osama bin Laden experience. What was worse? That Osama bin Laden was living in Abbottabad in this large compound right next door to the Pakistani equivalent of West Point, and the Pakistani authorities didn't know he was living there. Or Osama bin Laden was living in Abbottabad, close to the Pakistani equivalent of West Point, and some of the authorities did know that he was living there and didn't do anything about it. Choose your poison. Either way, it is not a reassuring scenario. And this, to me, is, so whether we use drones or not, we shouldn't kid ourselves. At times, we've been very supportive of Pakistan with massive amounts of aid. At other times, we've withdrawn the aid. And either way, we have difficulties. It reminds me of that old line from Harold Brown when he used to describe the U.S. relationships with the Soviet Union about the arms race. And he said, yeah, I think I've got it right, if I remember correctly. When we build, they build. And when we don't build, they build. And with Pakistan, it's a little bit like that. When we use support, they do things that give us heartburn. And when we use sanctions, they do things that give us heartburn.
Yeah, I don't want to give you heartburn, but let me raise an issue that hasn't been discussed, and that's the Eurozone financial problems and potential crisis. I mean, if this banking problem continues to spread, Spain, Ireland, Italy, Greece,
right,
and Europe really goes through a fundamental rethinking of even the sustainability of the European Union, or at least of the unified currency. How does that's a big development in the world for one of the major economic blocs in the world. How does that affect what we can or should do?
Okay, let me try to frame it this way. The Eurozone, which is a collection of 17 countries, it was forged on a essentially unworkable premise. And you took wildly disparate economies, a Germany and a Cyprus or Greece. It's hard to imagine. And if you had a dumbbell with, it'd be like 100 pounds on one side and 1 pound on the other side. That's what you've got. So wildly, and then countries were allowed to come into the Eurozone without meeting the requirements they were meant to meet. They're allowed to stay in the Eurozone after they demonstrated they couldn't meet the requirements. You didn't put into shape the European-wide mechanisms you knew you had to do in order to make it work. So this is a flawed enterprise on any and every level. That said, and I put Ireland in a separate case. Ireland has a very different set of challenges than the southern European countries. Ireland will be just fine, but the southern European countries do have real problems. I was just in Greece. Just even said 60% youth unemployment. That kind of a situation. These countries do face real challenges. That said, I think the Eurozone may well survive, despite what Europe is doing, simply because there's a large political commitment to keep it there. And above all, I think it's a question of when and not if France will become the crisis country. And it's one thing to deal with it if you're Greece or Spain or Italy or what have you, though Italy is obviously large. But France, for those of you who are old enough to remember, the entire concept of modern Europe was born in the 50s on the idea of Franco-German reconciliation. And the precursor of the European Union, the European Community, before that was the European Coal and Steel Community. Right. And the basics were the whole idea of it was to knit France and Germany so closely together, their interdependence would become so great that war, which had ravaged Europe for centuries, often led by France and Germany on opposing sides, would become simply unthinkable. And my hunch is when France becomes the country that's really in play, which is going to happen given Monsieur Hollande's economic policies, however you say unsustainable in French, it is pas sustainable. Trust me on that. I think the Germans will not let this fail. I think they will do enough, one way or another, to keep the Eurozone alive. I could be wrong, but that's my guess. They haven't been nearly, by the way, to make you feel good about the United States for a second, European authorities have not been nearly as creative or as courageous as American authorities were after 2008. To me, the comparison is quite stark, and what people like Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, Dim Geithner did. We're very fortunate that we had the individuals we did in place, I believe, who took some of the steps they did. The bigger problem in Europe, though, is actually not the Eurozone crisis. The bigger problem in Europe is that Europe is not growing. It's shrinking. If you look at the most recent, and it's either going to keep shrinking or drifting for years to come. And the reason is that even if there weren't a Eurozone crisis, there's a European economic condition. And none of the prerequisites, or few of the prerequisites of economic growth are being put into place in Europe. Labor mobility does not exist in most countries. The safety net is so extensive that you simply, it's unsupportable. Very little in the way of venture capital. A lot of the things that make this part of America work are simply not in place in Europe. You don't have the bankruptcy type laws. A failure in Europe can be in the economic sense, a life-ending experience. For here, it's a rite of passage for many, as many of our children seem intent on proving. And it's just a very different thing. Plus, in Europe, you've got very severe demographic challenges that we don't hear. So I'm much more worried about the economic condition of Europe than I am about the Eurozone crisis. What I think it means is that European share of global wealth, which is roughly, again, almost like ours, between 20 and 25%, that share is going to steadily shrink. I think what that means is that Europe is going to become more parochial. It's going to be much less of a partner. And one of the things I think it means for the United States is that, unlike the last era of history, where Europe was often our principal geopolitical partner, I think that era of history is ending. And that while there'll be the odd exception, we might do this with the Brits or this with the French or something, by and large, the Atlantic era of international relations, I would argue, is coming to a close. And we're not going to have this pool of partners in quite the same way that we had before. Again, it doesn't mean that Europe's unimportant. It will still be roughly a fifth or 18% of the world economy. If this trade agreement goes through, it will be something of a boon potentially for Europe. And again, the good news is that Europe is unlikely to be the great geopolitical battleground. Much more likely is the Middle East continues to be the most turbulent, destructive part of the world, and Asia is the most dynamic, and the challenge is to, if you will, to keep it dynamic in the positive sense rather than have the dynamism spill over. But I think essentially, whereas the 20th century was Eurocentric, the 21st century will not be.
That's almost a great way to end, but we do have time for one final question, and this is also at the sort of 30,000-foot level, which is, even though you are not yourself a declinist, you are not stating the U.S. is in decline, and you're certainly not advocating the U.S. should be in decline, are we in fact witnessing an incremental and inexorable decline of the United States
No.
as the number one economic and global power.
No. The United States is still first among unequals in the world and will remain so. Our economy is growing now at 1.5%, 2%, depending upon how, maybe a little slightly higher. It's hard to tell from quarter to quarter. So we're not in decline, full stop. We talked before about the energy situation. We still show a tremendous capacity for innovation, and that will make us, by the way, much more competitive. If we pass comprehensive immigration reform, I think it's a multiple gain. We'll get 12 million Americans out of the shadows on a path towards full participation in our society. We'll increase the inflow of talented people with advanced degrees and skills. If we invest in our infrastructure, which, by the way, takes virtually no public money through public-private partnerships, we can make ourselves, again, much more competitive in that way. To make our schools better, it doesn't take more money. It simply, again, means that we've got to have more higher quality teachers, which means putting more investment in the good ones and getting rid of the bad ones. We can deal with our entitlements. No, all of our challenges are fixable. And the real question to me is whether our politics are up to the challenge. It's the reason, again, I wrote this book, that I think the greatest threat facing us is nothing out there. It's not China, it's not Russia, it's not Pakistan, it's not Syria, it's not Iran. It's none of these. These are all manageable challenges. It's not even things like climate change, which we haven't talked about. These are serious challenges, but potentially, I think, manageable challenges if we put our house in order. So the real threat, the real challenge is ourselves. And whether we're going to essentially compete with special interests, so the national interest doesn't lose out, and whether we're going to have the kind of leadership we need in order to forge cooperation inside the Beltway. And I don't know the answer to that. And the reason quite honestly, I got out of my safe, comfortable space as a foreign policy guy in the world that people like Michael and I have occupied now for decades. And I'm writing about things like how to reform American politics and what we should be doing with local education or what have you, is I actually think this is now the principal determinant of American national security. It is what we do and don't do here at home. And if we get it right, I think the 21st century could be another American century. And if we get it wrong, then we will have no one to blame but ourselves.
Well, that concludes our program for tonight. On behalf of the World Affairs Council and the Council on Foreign Relations, I ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Richard Haass for this very insightful discussion. Well, one more comment. Many thanks.